I want everybody to understand that everything is open from chapter 1 to 6. Let me pull up the screen so you can see it. If you go to your weekly assignment, we all know that the assignment guide gives the dates of everything opening and closing. There's week 4. It does not show it's due this week. That's because I extended everything until the 11th of September. So you can go ahead and take 6. It's not due as it traditionally is on Sunday night, 11:59. It actually goes to Friday night at 11:59 on the 11th. Anybody have any questions about that? If there was an assignment you didn't complete, for example, a homework, if you made no attempt at all, it may allow you to go back in and retake that homework. If you got a horrible or horrific score on any of the homework and you want me to reopen it, I will. Just send me an email and I'll reopen it. But you have to remember, for me to reopen anything, it's going to require the deletion of your previous attempt. So if you had 18 out of 20, and you wanted to get 20 out of 20, just realize you're deleting an A. So just be careful with that. If I see that as a situation, I'll contact you before I delete. Any questions about that? So just remember, if you go directly into Mind tab, it's not going to show you anything that's due. Well, you can't get there. But let's see. If I go to week 4, go to support materials check for 4. I'll just select anything. It'll take me directly to Cengage. Give me a second, it's slow today. If I just look at Cengage, in week 5, it's going to show you 148, roughly over 100 assignments are due. Like it'll show you homework 1 is due, 2, 3, 4. As long as you got a score posted, you're good. Everything else is just to prepare you for the test. I want you to have all the materials you need to complete the test and successfully complete the test. I sent out an email where a student had a question, and I responded to the question explaining what I just explained to you. I just don't want anybody confused thinking there's nothing to do this week. Everything this week should focus on getting the test, best test score you can get next week. Okay. In chapter 6, let's see. When we look at the supply and demand, where the tax one starts out. We've looked at price controls that determine profitability and responses to changes in price and quantity. There's a lot of things going on with supply and demand. Now we're going to include taxes. And the slope of this demand curve and the slope of the supply curve will determine who pays the most out of that tax. Who's going to pay most of that burden? Now, in this case, they put a price on ice cream cone. And they have a tax with the equilibrium. This is what the seller will receive, $2.80. If the equilibrium is at 3, looks like they're adding a 50-cent tax. So based on supply and demand, the seller is going to receive $2.80. The consumer is going to pay an extra 30 cents. So most of the burden with this tax goes directly to the consumer. And this is with any product. It's with any business, be it a sole proprietorship, monopoly, monopolistic competition, partnership, corporation. They're all the same. They're in it to make a profit. So they're going to, in looking at this and knowing their product, the supply curve is elastic, they're going to push a lot of the burden over to the consumer. And by pushing that extra 30 cents to the consumer, you'll see a minimal change in quantity. Here we see a decrease in demand. We have a somewhat elastic demand curve. It's not equal. With the reduction in demand, the price the seller will receive is still $2.80, and the consumer is going to end up paying $3.30 for that same product. In the homeworks, they will give you these numbers. They'll give you the quantity changes, etc. But if you see an elastic type curve on demand or supply, the consumer is going to pay the bulk of that increase. If we see a situation, well, we bring up a graph that I have here. We can see here this first graph, draw mode. That I'm trying to use my regular pen instead of the stylus. Okay, on this graph, we see the inelasticity of supply. And demand. In both cases, it's going to throw it to consumer. Now, if the demand curve is more elastic than the supply curve, we can see that the producer is going to have to pay the bulk of those taxes. When you look at luxury items, and they talk about the luxury tax that came in place in about 1990, it was designed to make people that have money pay more for their toys. They put a tax on airplanes. They put a tax on luxury cars and on yachts. And with that situation, we look at an elastic demand curve with an inelastic supply, which is what we're looking at with a Hatteras Yacht Company. The buyers will not pay any more than this for the tax. Consumer said, anything above this, I'm not participating. But look at what the seller receives. The seller receives a much lower portion or income from the sale of that product. If we have elastic supply and inelastic demand, it goes the other way. Look at gasoline. Gasoline is more of an inelastic on both. And in that case, the consumer is going to eat that tax. When they put a tax on imports of oil, that is put in place and is sent directly down to the consumer. We just have to look at each individual graph and determine how to apply it. I'm going back through this PowerPoint, stuff we looked at Monday. I'm going to see the price controls. We dealt with that. And we go straight to taxes. The government needs taxes to operate. Based on your political position, you may determine that they need more and need to spend more than the other individuals. Everybody has opinions, and there's varying opinions. We can go all the way from anarchists to socialists. You go all across the political spectrum, and each one of them has a different idea of how government should be run and how invasive the government should be. But regardless of what you think about the taxes, there are some things that the school does better than anyone else. They build roads, they build schools, and they handle national defense. Now this is the federal level right here. Now we have states and locals that build the roads. We state or local. But the national defense is normally strictly controlled by the federal government. Some states have, all states have reserve personnel, National Guard. They can call up on a state level if necessary, or the president could call them up on to go to war, go to Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran. Well, not Iran, but so the government is the primary protector of your rights, or that's what it should be. Now, the tax incidence, the manner in which the burden of the tax is shared among participants in the market. The government can make the seller or buyer pay the tax. They can't necessarily make them pay the tax because the consumer does have the choice not to participate. In this situation, we have an equilibrium without tax. For this product, whatever it is, pizza, it's $10 and 500 units. We have a quantity to be supplied at that level, and we have a quantity to be demanded at that level that equals 10 and 500, which is our equilibrium, where Q of S is equal to Q of D. The Q of S, well, Went the wrong way. We're looking at the point where Q of S is equal to Q of D. That is our equilibrium. That's the point where supply and demand are equal. Now, if they put a $1.50 tax per unit on the buyers, the demand curve is going to move. The demand curve is going to shift inward. We see the $1.50 tax from $10. We see the movement of the demand curve. So this would be our new pricing point. And that would be explicitly the consumer paying this price. And the seller's basically going to receive $8.50. Here we see it added on the sellers. Okay, we see the new tax is applied here. We have a new equilibrium that's going to establish price and quantity. So with this new shift to this point, we're going to see a reduction of 50 units and a reduction of the price that the seller receives is going to go to $9.50. The buyer, now we take the price all the way up to the demand curve, because this is the price that the consumer says they're willing to pay at that quantity. So the consumer is going to end up paying $1 of that tax. We don't need pizza to survive. There are a lot of substitutes available. So the consumer is going to have to pay it. Now, the supplier of the pizza is also going to suffer with the reduction in supply. Now it shows us the tax. The tax is $1.50, price the buyer pays and price the seller receives. We see who pays the most of it. It's going to be the consumer. This area, right here. This is a market failure. For reasons other than the market itself, we're seeing a reduction in quantity and a reduction in what the seller will receive and an increase in what the buyer will pay. This is what we call deadweight loss. There's production that could exist here, but it's not because of the tax. The tax directly on the consumer is going to reduce their desire to purchase those goods. And like I said, with the wealth tax or the luxury tax that was put in place in 1990, it hit airplanes, yacht companies, and automobiles. Most of the automobile manufacturing of the high dollar sort that were produced in Great Britain or Europe, we didn't see as much production of those products in the United States. They weren't affected as much as, or we didn't feel the effect as much as we did with the yachts and the airplanes. Hatteras Yacht Company went bankrupt because of this. They laid off a lot of skilled workers. And when they did that, they went on unemployment. They went on WIC, they did whatever they needed to survive. They had issues with paying their mortgages and their car loans. So there was a lot of pain that was received, and it wasn't by the person that had the money. The pain that was felt directly from the tax went primarily to the middle class workers and some high skilled middle class workers. They were excellent in their trade. We saw the same thing in the aviation industry. I was in that industry at that time, and I made a lot of money on it because I had people bring me their airplanes, and they wanted them painted, new interiors, rebuild the engines, any upgrades I could do to the airplane, avionics. That's what I did. They did that instead of paying that luxury tax on a new airplane. The major suppliers of airplanes, private and business, Piper, Beechcraft, Cessna, Learjet, all of them went bankrupt because the demand went away. People said, well, we'll just upgrade what we have, or, you know, a 2-year-old jet is still working fine, or a 5-year-old jet is still working fine. So instead of writing it off, they just pay for upgrades and then amortize that over a period of time. So as a government, they say they can control who pays the taxes, but that's not wholly true. They can control who they think is going to pay the taxes. But the reality is it's all based on the supply and demand for those products. If we were looking at a tax, put a 100% tax on salt, table salt, I would not even know it, because I don't buy it enough to make a difference, and the curve is inelastic. It's something that I need, but its cost, as far as my income is concerned, is minuscule. But when you tax these luxury items, you see individuals making choices to do something else, find a better way. Now, a tax incident is the burden of taxes shared by the market participants. I think I mentioned it before with Hattershot Company and the others that went bankrupt. We're talking hundreds of thousands of workers. The General Accounting Office found out the government paid out more in services for those individuals that were laid off than they ever received from the tax. So we see right there that the consumer just said, and that was the wealthy consumer, said, no, thank you. Now, the tax incident, the burden based on the pizza should be falling on the consumer. Now, if you went and bought pizza every day, you would see this big change, the $1.50 tax. Most individuals go there once a month, once every 2 months, or even less frequent than that. They would not notice this change, and they would probably pay it. So when we look at the tax incidents, they just want to know who pays what. Now, here's a $1.50 tax imposed on sellers. This is just like if we're looking at Hershey's and the price of sugar goes up. We will see the reduction in supply, because the consumers, the business is going to say, I'm not going to supply the same amount for an increased price. So in this case, we see the tax solely on the supplier. It's going up here. Remember when we were looking at the other, we were looking at the tax being solely on the consumer via demand shift. And we saw the full $1.50 drop to here. And when that price came to this point, remember that affected our new demand curve. This is going to show us the new supply curve. And here's the tax that exists. Now we're going to have a new equilibrium. We go over to the price axis and down to the quantity axis, and that'll help us determine the tax incidence. So we see the new supply curve. Quantity is the same. Tax incidence is the same. So it doesn't matter which way the tax is applied, either to the business or to consumer. In this case, with pizza, it's not that big a difference. In fact, we're seeing that tax incidence remains the same. The seller will receive $9.50 and the consumer will pay $11. There's identifying our deadweight loss, which is in this area right here. The difference between the price the consumer pays and the price the seller receives is $1.50. They're talking about the wedge. Anytime they're referring to the wedge, it's this area right here. This is a market failure. We had external forces, government forces affect the quantity and supply. Let's look at the market for bicycles. It's an equilibrium as a graph. Okay, so the government imposes on buyers a $30 tax. Now what we're going to do is our equilibrium is price is 100. We're going to reduce this to 70, and this will show us the point where we'll receive the new demand curve. We're going to place the tax at $30 here. That'll define our new quantity at 80, because all we had to do to determine that tax, they said it was 30. Let's find the difference of 30. There's 80, 110. That shows the tax. That shows the quantity. There's the price the buyers pay, and here's the price the sellers receive. Now in this case, if we go back to the basic equilibrium, we can see that based on this supply and demand curve, the demand curve being elastic in nature, supply curve being a little more inelastic, but not inelastic in general. Looks like a slope of 1 as it moves off the graph. The demand curve is elastic. And in this case, if we take and draw a line based on equilibrium, it should be right here. I had to figure out why that keeps going up, but that's a new. Our original was 190 and 100. So we have, this is the wedge. Consumer pays $10 and the seller loses $20. So in this case, when this tax is applied, as the policymakers we send to Washington, they should understand this difference between elastic and inelastic and who's going to end up paying the tax. If they're not, they need an economist on the payroll to explain it to them in very simple terms. Because it's not rocket science. These curves do tell us where the tax incidence will be applied at a greater rate. Now, both buyer and seller are going to share the burden, but it's not going to share it equally unless we're looking at a situation where the demand curve is a -1 slope, or the supply curve is a +1 slope, or any linear curve with constant slope that demand and supply are moving together at the same slope, just one at negative, one at positive. That's the only time we'll see a shared tax burden. Anytime we're looking at a tax burden or tax incidence, the elasticity of the demand and supply curve will have a huge impact on who's going to pay these taxes. They're showing us here the price if no tax would be at this point. We have an inelastic demand curve. Now, if they apply a tax at this point, this will be the price the sellers receive, and this will be the price that the consumers will pay. The tax incidence will be here, and this will be our deadweight loss. Because it is an inelastic demand curve, if we're looking at the supply, gotta get better at these. We'll see a reduction in quantity, but it'll be minimal to what we would see with an elastic curve. Buyers share the tax burden, absolutely. The sellers share the tax burden, but at a different rate. Now, what will happen is you'll see buyers and consumers leaving the market. From this point, at original equilibrium, at this point to this point, all along this demand curve, those are consumers that are leaving the marketplace. They're no longer willing to participate at that original new price, not at the same level. Now, in the case of this graph, the distance between here and here is much less. It doesn't matter to them. We see suppliers exiting the market from here to here. They're saying, no thanks. I don't want it anymore. This supply curve represents where the company is not losing money producing our product. So their average cost is 0. Their average total cost is 0. And their average total revenue is 0. So it all equals out. So if their cost is $10 and their price is $10, they'll sell. But if the price is, their cost is $11 and they sell it for $8, they're not going to participate. They're going to exit the marketplace. But here we see more buyers leaving the marketplace than sellers. Now, in this case, just think back to cigarettes. They place a major tax on cigarettes. And the sole purpose was or intended purpose was to get people to stop smoking. And it did. And now we're looking at a large, it used to be about 50% of the population smoked. Now it's very low, considering where it was 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Here we have inelastic supply and elastic demand. We see the tax incidence here. We see a lot of sellers leaving the marketplace. So there'll be a major exodus of suppliers that will leave the marketplace. They're not willing to sell this product at the new price. But we also lose consumers. But it's minimal in relation to the suppliers that exit the market. We have another market failure. This is deadweight loss. Anytime we don't produce at the level or equilibrium, we are in market failure, regardless of who or how it happened. This case being the government tax. Now here's the price consumers will pay. But look at what the seller will receive. With an inelastic supply curve, the seller is going to have to eat most of that tax. You'll see a lot of businesses exit the marketplace. Now, if we're looking at just right here, at that price, the consumer will be willing to pay a lot of that cost. If the price was here, but it's not. The buyer's share of the tax burden or tax incidence, we will fall on the business. Here they talk about the luxury tax. On yachts, private airplanes, furs, jewelry, expensive cars. The furs and the jewelry, and the cars were not the big deal. The yachts and the private airplanes were. Now, one of the loopholes they had on the yachts was, and also on the airplanes, if they were purchased new outside the country, they did not pay the tax, that luxury tax. So if you bought a yacht under a foreign keel, which means the majority of the boat was built in another country, you're not liable for the luxury tax. So a lot of those individuals that had a yacht company came up and said, they were told by their buyers, now yours is 10% higher, and we can go to Europe or Greece or in those areas, and we can buy a boat that's 10% longer at the same price, because we don't have to pay the tax. And if they were not leasing it, they didn't have a problem. If they were leasing the airplane or the yacht, and they had a foreign keel or foreign manufacturer, if it wasn't approved for the U.S., it does not get in. You can't rent or lease, which was a problem for some of the companies and individuals. Anytime we look at luxury items, we learned this back in chapter 3, 4. It was 4 and 5, I believe. Luxury items. Demand is quite elastic, and supply is relatively inelastic. So if you look at the yachts, we have a supply curve. There's not a lot of people making these yachts. Here's our price and quantity at equilibrium. And they place a tax on the product. We have members of the marketplace that are exiting because this change in price, here to here, they're leaving. But we also have a lot of burden that's going to be supplied by the business. This is what happened to Hatteras Yacht Company and other yacht companies around the country. Consumers just made a choice. They didn't get rich by being stupid, unless you win the lottery, maybe. We've seen some very strange things happen to people who win that big lottery. But they make decisions based on price, just like you and I do it when we go to the grocery store and look at steaks and hamburger. We do it on price. So if I'm putting this tax on here and I'm a legislator, I have to know the impact it's going to have. About 2008, probably 2010, 2011, there was a push to go with a luxury tax on corporate jets. There was a huge outcry from the manufacturers that said, you've done this before and you've killed us. And the only people that suffered were the workers, our highly skilled and well-paid workers. Do we want to take this path again? All the rumbling was for about 6 months, and then it kind of died away and it was never heard of again. So evidently, some of the economists and historians came back and explained to the legislatures or the individuals pushing this idea that it would, in essence, hurt the worker more than it hurt the people with the money, or the businesses, or the corporations. So we can see who pays the share. The biggest share is going to be with the seller. Smallest share will be the consumer. And you got to remember, this share that they receive, the price that they get, they originally had the product up there for X, and now we're looking at a much lower pricing. So if their cost, let's say this was $1 million, that was their break-even point, say Hatteras, and they were willing to produce a yacht at $1 million. When they only receive $800,000, they're no longer participating in this marketplace. All they're doing is throwing money away, trying to compete. Now, they did keep a skeleton crew for upkeep and everything on, and upgrades on existing yachts, but their building department was decimated. Let's say government wants to increase taxes. They want more revenue. And the government proposes a tax on food because everyone must eat, and thus a food tax would surely raise a great deal of tax revenue. You insist the tax should be placed on food sellers to protect the poor who spend a large proportion of their income on food. First of all, will the tax burden of the food tax fall only on the sellers of the good as the consumer set? We can go back and look at our graphs. Food in general is an inelastic curve, not unlike what we see here. And if we go back, we can see inelastic supply curve. Who pays? The business will pay the majority of it if it's a supply issue. But when we raise the tax on the consumers, and it's now we're going to see that inelastic demand curve, the consumer is going to pay the majority of that tax. Why? Because the suppliers know that you have to have food to survive. Therefore, they're going to transfer the cost over to you, the consumer. Now, they can make the cereal boxes stay the same size, but reduce the cereal in the box. It won't be as obvious as if you go look at the steaks and chickens and so forth, and you see the actual price per pound increase. So it doesn't matter who it is placed on. The consumer is going to pay it. And if the curve is inelastic, demand curve is inelastic, they're going to pay the bulk of it. And that should answer the B. Who will bear most of this tax burden? It will be the consumers because of the inelastic demand curve. Now, if it's a small percentage of our income like table salt, no big deal. But if you're looking at food as a commodity, the curve is inelastic. And individuals have to make choices. That's the reason they have oodles of noodles and all the other goodies in place. So in a nutshell, just go back and explain or define and explain price ceilings and price floors. There's going to be a market failure because anytime you have a price or a commodity that's not at equilibrium, it is a market failure. If the price is above equilibrium, that means either way, the quantity is going to fall in the marketplace. Either the consumer doesn't want it, if it's, we go to the demand curve, or the seller is not going to sell it because of the reduced revenue on the supply side. They do share the burden on just about everything, but it's not equitable. Any questions about Chapter 6? I'm going to stop sharing. Any questions about Chapter 6, Chapter 5, Chapter 4, 3, 2, or 1? Because the next time I'll see you, the test will be opened up and the thesis and outline should be submitted somewhere in the early part of the week. That's another thing I wanted to show you. If we go to Blackboard, I'm just going to go to the weekly Eco 251 IO1. If you go to collaboration and this discussion board, go to discussion board, we will see that the thesis and outline discussion board is already there. I want you to submit your thesis and outline in this discussion board. And from that discussion board, I will give commentary on the material and where the direction you're heading. It doesn't matter if I agree or disagree with your thesis or the position you take. It's the structure and how you're going to support that thesis or refute that thesis. That's what I want to see is the process. And that's what the outline is going to show me, is where you're going to go. Now, I don't have to be long and drawn out, just general information. You have your supporting ideas and main points. That's all I need. It doesn't have to be complete sentences. It could be bullets. I'm fine. Prefer to be in MLA format. That'll make it easier to go from one to the next and find what I'm looking for. But this is already open. So if you have a thesis and outline completed, you can submit it at any time. Once I go through your thesis and outline, and I send you commentary, that's when I'll probably grade it. I still want you to go through the weekly assignments. Let me just go here. And if you look at week 5, you should see the test in here. Let me do it this way. It shows test 1 is there, and it should show the thesis and outline is due as well. There's the thesis and outline. It unlocks on September 7th at 12 a.m. You see, it's worth 5% of your final grade, so don't ignore it. Make sure you submit something, because you hate to lose those points. It's the easiest points you'll ever receive. Okay, I'm open for questions. Any questions from anyone? Is everybody ready to make 100 on this test? Ethan? You have any questions?
As of right now, I have no questions.
Okay. At any point, just let me know. Okay, Alexis says, no, sir. I don't want anybody at the end of the semester to say that they couldn't find me and they couldn't get answers. I give you a lot of ways to communicate with me. I do have an open forum, Collaborate forum, that if you have questions and you want to meet there and look at material, we can do that. I'll set up so you can share files as well. Okay. We're at 11:50.